Thank you very much for joining us. Where do you stand on this, James? What should happen?
Well, I think talking to Tory MPs over the last couple of weeks or so, I do think there's been a slight shift in the party. At the beginning of the year, I think there was real optimism that this could be tackled within the existing framework. I think more and more we're now hearing what the sort of similar to what the Prime Minister's been said, which is that the international legal conventions which govern us, I think Tory MPs are certainly examining the case and arguing it publicly and privately that they need to be re-examined and made sure they're fit for the 21st century. So I think that's a big conversation that's going to be going on, and one that'll continue not just up until the election, but in the years that there follows.
I don't understand, James, why this is a conversation only being had now, because I, for one, was well aware of migratory routes being exploited at the very least by pretty sinister operatives such as the Wagner mercenaries connected to a lot of the people trafficking cartels in Africa. We've seen Putin bus a load of migrants to the border of Belarus and Poland, where they stood there sort of rattling the fences. Finland's just had to close their border with Russia for trying the same thing there. Plenty of accusations about how the Taliban might have lined its pockets using people trafficking. And yet, if I was aware of this a good couple of years ago, how can the government are only saying it and talking loosely and lightly about doing something about it now?
You make a number of good points. I think the sense within the current existing governments was that Meloni's government was elected a year ago. Sunak came to power in October last year. There was a sense of, OK, we'll try the existing tools. And I think after 12 months of trying them, Meloni's government, unfortunately, has seen twice as many small boats enter as was a year ago. And Rishi Sunak, despite using a number of different devices and trying to put a lot of resources behind it, I've only seen the small boats crossings coming down by a third. So I think that while there has been some awareness about some of the issues you raised there, Alex, rightly so, I think now with the kind of challenges that both premiers have faced, with Meloni's attempts to offshore migrants and process them in Albania, and Sunak's attempts to do the same with the Rwanda scheme, the continued legal challenges both are facing mean that increasingly I think politicians are willing to try unconventional and novel methods to try and deal with this, including looking at the existing framework.
Well, there we see Rishi and Giorgia having their love affair in Rome. They'll always have Rome. The thing is that Giorgia Meloni, when she came into power, said that she was going to stop the boats coming across from Africa and the Middle East across the Mediterranean. And by the way, the numbers we're talking about there are enormous. Maybe 750,000 coming into Italy over the next year, potentially. She hasn't done much. She hasn't done anything because she's been lent on by the EU that kind of liked all this. So they've said, we're sorting out your national debt. You have to do what you're told. So she is doing what she's told, but still talking tough. Meanwhile, we all know about Rishi Sunak, talking tough, talking tough, talking tough, never walking tough. Now, a lot of Tories, James, today said, very impressive. The Prime Minister's really ratcheting up the rhetoric. Don't they understand we are sick to death of rhetoric? Rishi Sunak saying, I'll stop at nothing to stop the boats. Well, you won't turn them round in the middle of the channel. You won't leave the European Convention on Human Rights. There are loads of things Rishi Sunak will stop at before stopping the boats. If he doesn't understand, the rhetoric has got to end and action has to start. He's just cruising to some kind of crashing electoral defeat, I think.
Well, I think there has been an ongoing conversation within the Conservative Party, and the debate has shifted to the right, I'd say, over the last 12 months or so. We saw this with the Rwanda bill just a couple of weeks ago, where the Conservative MPs were debating and putting forward proposing solutions that I think a year or so ago would have not got anywhere near political consideration. But I do take your point about whether it's going to be enough. And I suspect that people watching this will feel sharing that sense of frustration. And I'll be interested to see whether the Conservatives will lose votes more to the right or to the left come the election. I suspect it'll be a bit of both. But I think with those increasing voices calling for more action on all this, there will be a lot of pressure which Conservative MPs will be exerting in the next few months ahead to try and stop a shift to, for instance, the Reform Party, and also those kind of voices which want Rishi Sunak to go further and opt out of the ECHR.
It never rains, but it pours for the Prime Minister, and it turns out today that campaigners have accused the Home Office of breaking its own rules when it comes to housing migrants at the former RAF Wethersfield site, where a quarter of them have had to be moved into hotels because they didn't meet the suitability criteria. Now, my understanding of that is these people might have had mental health issues or been, apparently minors, or people who were deemed perhaps a little bit too fragile to be put in that particular accommodation. And now there's potentially going to be legal action against the Home Office, yet another headache for the government.
Yeah, well, it's also because the RAF Weatherfield site is owned by the Ministry of Defence. That means it's a military site. As a military site, it can only be used for men between 18 to 65 who pass some, health standards, mental health, for instance. So therefore, if you get other people who are not part of that criteria, who say they've been the subject of torture or war crimes, then obviously they will not hit that criteria and then have a strong legal case to be moved off it. You also have a number of groups like Care for Calais, for instance, which are keen to take up and run with these cases. And the problem is, I think, where do you put migrants who come here, asylum seekers, etc.? And there isn't an obvious answer. Tory MPs don't want to see them in the £6 million a day hotel bills. They don't want to see them in their constituency. So they tend to be put in places like military sites. Unfortunately, with quite a litigious community supporting them, it is no surprise to see a lot of asylum seekers getting moved out of there. And I think it is a game as a whack-a-mole, where every time a different place is found, more objections are raised.
Exactly, James. And that's the problem, isn't it? That Rishi's alternative accommodation initiative or initiatives really have not worked out. Every single one of them has failed really to get off the ground. The Bibi Stockholm barge still only has about 300 migrants on board. It's supposed to have 500. And as for the various disused RAF air bases, renovated prisons, renovated holiday camps that were supposed to be used, they're not happening because guess what? Local communities are objecting and it gets tied up in the courts. They're not happening. So we are stuck with 500 hotels full of migrants and rising. Now, those hotels are all within communities, and those communities are full of voters. They will not vote for the Tories while all of this is going on. His alternative accommodation schemes simply are not working.
Well, quite. And I was talking to one MP who is in a coastal constituency, and they make the point that these hotels traditionally would be used for bringing in tourists who then spend money in the local area. So it's not just the fact that taxpayer money is being diverted to being spent on these hotels. It's also the knock-on effects for the local and secondary economies around those hotel areas. And it's no surprise we see, for instance, in this reporting today about the RAF Weatherfield site, that the young men there are getting bored, and there's concerns and reports about fights breaking out, for instance, because you have huge numbers coming into these places, which I think does pose a lot of risks and involvement, etc. And it's no surprise then that everyone does become a bit of an immigration NIMBY, not in my backyard, because no one, frankly, wants to have huge numbers coming in who are economically inactive for a long time. What's the solution? And the problem is, for Rishi Sunak, I think all those solutions are a choice between the unpalatable and the disastrous, and we're 12 months out from an election.
James, thank you ever so much.